guess they expected me to walk.
What?
So I spent about 15 years of my life working as a lawyer. And one of the things I learned when that legal career began in 2000, one of those, I guess you'd call it unwritten rules, was that when you're in a public setting like a trial, you don't ask a question that you don't know the answer to. You don't know where that's going to go. But guess what? I'm not a lawyer anymore, and I feel real comfortable with all you guys. So I'd like to break the rule with you here today. Would you guys be up for that? Yes, all right. Now the question I'm going to ask is a real important one, and it's not rhetorical. So I want you to shout out the answer for me, and I'm pretty confident you guys are going to get it right. You got a 50-50 shot. Here's the question. Do you want to play? Yes, see, I knew I could count on you guys. It's an important question because do you remember that time in your life when you might feel a connection to someone in your neighborhood? And I know friendships might have been restrained by, your how far you could go in your neighborhood or how far you could ride your bike. But do you remember that time when you could make that connection and just say, do you want to play? You didn't check their Facebook account, their political affiliations, anything, right? You just had that connection and you played. And I like to call that time period, I guess, the single-digit era, right? Before we turn 10. There might be a little wiggle room there, but that single-digit era was great, right? Because we were connecting with people on that basis. What was another great thing about the single-digit era? You had a license. I bet you didn't even know you had a license. Do you know what license you had back then? The license to be whatever you wanted to be. You had the license to be whatever you wanted to be. And when you were playing with those friends of a similar age and connecting with them, you might very well get the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to be when you grow up? And you might have got that question from your parents, from teachers, from all sorts of people. What do you want to be when you grow up? And when you answer that question with what within your heart that day. It might have been doctor, it might have been teacher, it might have been a lawyer the other day, it might have been police officer. But what's clear when you answer that question, I bet none of you answer that question saying, well, I'd like to be a teacher, but I'd like to raise a family, make about $35,000 a year, so I don't think I should be a teacher. Or you didn't say something like, well, I want to be a doctor. I'd really like to help people, but boy, that's a lot of schooling, and then the malpractice insurance, I'm going to get sued. No, I'm not going to do it. A doctor, you just answered what was within your heart. And apart from being the single-digit era, I like to think of that time as a time in our lives when we were living closest to our greatness. We were connecting with people. We were dreaming unfettered. And didn't that feel damn good? Didn't that time feel damn good? So how do we get back to that place, right? That question of what you want to be when you grow up kind of flown the coop to some degree because we've all committed the cardinal sin of growing up, right? We're not in that single-digit era anymore. How do we then reconnect to that greatness? How do we then reconnect to that feeling, that unfettered dreaming and those unfettered connections? Well, it begins, I think, by asking ourselves a question that's kind of an update on the what do you want to be when you grow up. Had we gotten more than the 2 seconds of the song, you would have heard that question. It's a simple question. Who do you want to be today? Who do you want to be today? Now think of the power in that question. It doesn't force you to look back at who you've been. It doesn't bother with concerns about what might happen. It doesn't limit you in any way whatsoever. any practicality, any childhood imprinting, anything of that nature is all swept away in that present moment question. But that question can be a hard question to answer. Who do you want to be today? Some of you, that answer might pop right in your head. But you're not there for several reasons. Or you might not even be able to find the answer. You might not be able to see the answer because there's all those chains and those attachments and those adult practicalities blocking your vision. I want to tell you today how this played out for me. That legal career I talked about earlier, I'd been about 15 years into it, and I just finished the most arduous case of my life. Probably the most arduous case any lawyer could undertake. For those not unfamiliar, in 2013, January 2nd of 2013, as a matter of fact, I stood up before a courtroom and announced myself as the attorney for a woman who would become rather infamous in our world, Jodi Ann Arias. And when I did that, my life changed. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was on camera 24/7 a day. There were 4 hours of news coverage after the trial was over. It was everywhere. It had swallowed me up. It had consumed my life. And keep in mind, this started on January 2nd of 2013. She was finally sentenced for various reasons in April of 2015. And the day after she was sentenced, I was exhausted. I had lived with so much pressure, the death threats, everything else in my life. But what had happened is that day, April 15th, was the first time in my life, ever since working so hard to become a lawyer and working my way through law school and all those things, that I didn't want to practice law anymore. I could feel it in my heart. Now that was rather disruptive to me because I'd been so long, I built this career, all those practical considerations, right? I'd spent 15 years practicing law, 3 years going to law. I didn't want anything of it. And then the practicality was winning. It was winning. I was going through this internal battle. What was I going to do? And there was I couldn't even see. I was like one of those people that couldn't even see what the future could hold if I left. And so I took a few months off. I chalked it off to, burnout, stress, and it made sense, right? And when it starts to cool down here in September in Phoenix, I started to think about going back to the law practice. Then something appeared in my life that kept me away. It was a growth underneath my armpit. It was my lymph node. It was inflamed because it was infested with cancer. The stress of the trial and everything else involved in it, in my heart anyway, I knew that was the reason I had cancer. And for those of you unfamiliar, stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma requires 6 rounds of chemotherapy. And at that point in my life, I was in my mid-40s, and I began to wonder if it was worth the fight. I was beaten down. I began to wonder, could I rebuild my life? I didn't see a path for it. And I look back, I remember hearing something when somebody said that first the universe will give you a nudge, and then it'll hit you with a 2x4. And that cancer was my 2x4. Because guess what? It came right before I was ready to jump in to the practice of law. Jump back in. It kept me out. So I was dealing with all these practical considerations, all this else, and the one thing, though, that became an overriding force that cancer gave me, in a sense, That's something that I think is so important for all of you to understand. When you think about that question, who you want to be today, and maybe delaying that, is cancer made my mortality a reality in a way that it never had before. I was forced to look at it in my face. The actuarial table said I had a 30% chance of not surviving that cancer. 70% chance of winning is pretty good if it's a bet in Vegas on a sports game. It's not so great when the losing 30% is your life. And I realized at that moment that when I had the courage and when I finally summoned the strength to go to chemotherapy, part of that was based on a promise to myself that I was not going to live my remaining years the way I had the first 49. I was not going to live with that stress. I was going to live with what I call joyful urgency. And that meant all those practical considerations going astray. All the money I made, all the spent doing it, everything, all those and my past, that wake of our boat that so many of us down. I had to shed all that in order to move on. But believe it or not, there's something else. Simon talked about this concept a little earlier. I didn't even really realize it until a few weeks ago. I had to shed my shame. I had to divorce myself from my shame. Because, see, what Brene Brown tells us is that shame is the fear of detachment. And when you think about all those things that keep you where you don't want to be, the childhood imprinting, the practicality, all those things, what are they? Aren't they just symptoms of a greater fear of detachment? That the people that we love and care about aren't going to love and care about us the same way because we're rejecting their sage advice? Because we're rejecting their wisdom? I guess so. But ultimately, that's it. We have to be able to shed that shame. And I brought up my shame, and I want to share a little bit of it with you. How to deal with that last crucial step. In 2015, after I published a book about the trial, the state of Arizona's Bar Association and I had different views about the ethical propriety of writing that book. And I realized, though, that I also had this promise to myself of not living the same way. I didn't want to be disbarred, if you will, but I didn't want to practice law anymore. And I knew, my lawyers thought it was crazy. I said, no, I don't want to accept any suspension. I don't want to accept anything else. I want out. Because I knew I had to cut the cord. So I didn't want to go back. You say, what does shame have to do with this? Well, I knew, based on everything I'd been through, based on the notoriety, the infamy, whatever you want to call it, of those 2.5 years, that if I requested that, the headline or the tagline wouldn't be, Kirk Nurmi requests disbarment because he wants to move on with his life. It would be Nurmi disbarred, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. I knew that. And I knew that that would cast shame upon me. I was disbarred. I would be branded. Detachment. Detachment from my lawyer friends. Detachment from some of the people that helped me on my way. I didn't know what it was going to be. And I mentioned that this really came into my view a couple weeks ago. It's so funny who we can learn from, because I saw an interview with Monica Lewinsky of the Clinton scandal, right? with John Oliver. And she talked about public shaming, being a victim of that. And remember, her public shaming was so long ago, it wasn't in the social media era. Mine was. That trial, just to make sure you get a sense of it, that trial was live streamed all over the world. My email address was on every pleading. I could get threatened from all over the globe, like in real time. During the trial, if I mispronounced something, or they didn't like my ties, or I was heavy, my weight, they didn't like my hair, whatever it was, I was being shamed. Ultimately, I was being shamed. And the analogy I use, because I know you're not probably going to be in that situation, but I realized as I was coming out and thinking about wanting to shed myself of this law license of mine, that the shame, I use the analogy of paintballs, right? It's the same shame that's hurled at you. I just had more guns pointed at my direction, right? It's the shame that those people you see once a year, like Aunt Betty, right, who tells you you're not driving the right car, you don't have the right job, your sexual choices aren't right. Why are you still with that guy? Why are you having children yet? Right? You think about that. What is that? That's all shame being hurled in your direction, being shot in your direction. And that's exactly what was happening to me. It was just more intense. It was just more intense. It was coming around me for months at a time. And then I had this decision to make. What was I going to do? I made the choice, and I put in a request to be disbarred. I didn't want a suspension. And it was granted around Thanksgiving of 2016. And guess what? It was awesome. It was an awesome day in my life. Thank you. It was an awesome day in my life, but here's what this has to do with shame, what I realized. And it's equally as applicable to you with the shame that gets hurled upon you on the holidays or anywhere else, or online, with your friends, your family, anything else. Those paintballs, they may hit you. And they're always going to hit you. But ultimately, you have the choice. You can't stop them from coming at you. But you have a choice of whether you let the stain stay on you. You have a choice. Do I let these paintballs of shame restrain me from being who I want to be today? Because that's what they do if you don't wash them off. Do you want the paintballs of shame to keep you in a relationship that you don't want to be in because you don't want the shame of divorce? Do you want the paintballs of shame to make you feel bad about the amount of money you make, whether it's too high or too low? Do you want any of that? And I'm guessing no, right? Nobody wants that. And so when I made that decision to ask for that disbarment and have that happy day, what I didn't realize at the time was that I was washing that paint off of me. I was taking all that shame that had been pelted in my direction. And I do mean pelted, boy. Life threatened, everything else. I'm not kidding about that. But I had the choice. I washed it off. I washed it off, and I found a new life. I found a new life doing what I love. Part of it is this writing, part of it's all different things. But I never contemplated that day in April of 2015 when I was first having that feeling that I wanted to get off or out of the law. So the question for you is, what shame do you need to wash off? What shame do you need to get through? Because think about it too. When we love something, we treasure it, we value it, right? You've got to love that period in your life and find it again and find that connection again by answering that question, who do you want to be today? And if paint comes your way, wash that shit off. right? Follow your heart. Do what you need to do because the life you live is yours. And I know this because when I sat down there with my mortality in my view, I knew that I never wanted to live with regrets. And fortunately, I had a chance to redress that with my mortal body. And you do now. Go forward and love your greatness and shed your shame. Thank you so much.